It was a chilly evening in downtown New York, and the city buzzed with life as people hurried in and out of fancy restaurants. Inside Le Grand Bistro, a well-known upscale restaurant, the manager, Richard Coleman, prided himself on maintaining a certain level of elegance. So when a young woman in worn-out clothes stepped inside, his instincts kicked in. "Miss, I'm afraid we can't serve you here," Richard said firmly, eyeing her tattered jacket and scuffed shoes. He barely gave her a chance to speak before motioning toward the door. The woman hesitated for a moment, then let out a quiet sigh. But before she turned to leave, she met his gaze and said something that made his stomach drop. "I own this restaurant." For a moment, silence filled the restaurant. The soft clinking of silverware and distant murmurs of diners faded as Richard's breath caught in his throat. He studied the woman again, suddenly uncertain. "That's impossible," he scoffed, though there was a flicker of doubt in his voice. The young woman crossed her arms, her sharp green eyes locked onto his. "Check the records," she said calmly. "Or better yet, ask the head chef. I'm Evelyn Carter, the owner of Le Grand Bistro." A murmur spread through the restaurant as curious patrons turned their heads. The head chef, a stout man with graying hair, emerged from the kitchen just in time to hear her words. His eyes widened in shock before a knowing smile spread across his face. "Miss Carter?" he exclaimed, wiping his hands on his apron. "It's really you?" Richard's face paled. He had worked at Le Grand Bistro for nearly 3 years, but he had never met Evelyn Carter in person. He had only heard of her, a successful entrepreneur who had built the restaurant from the ground up before stepping away to travel. And now, she was standing right in front of him, dressed not in the designer suits he had imagined but in simple, worn clothes. Evelyn let out a small sigh, her gaze softening. "I was away for a while," she explained, "but I wanted to see how things were running. So I came in dressed like this." She gestured to her clothes. "I wanted to know if my restaurant truly welcomed everyone, not just those who look wealthy." A lump formed in Richard's throat as shame washed over him. He had judged her, just as he had likely judged others before her. Evelyn turned to the diners, offering them a polite smile. "Please enjoy your meals," she said before facing Richard again. "Come with me." Without another word, she walked past him toward the back office. Richard swallowed hard, then followed, knowing that this was a conversation he could not avoid. Richard followed Evelyn into the restaurant's private office, his heart pounding. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him, but he kept his head high, hoping to explain himself. Evelyn shut the door gently and turned to face him. Her expression wasn't one of anger, but something worse, disappointment. "Richard," she said calmly, "tell me, what do you think makes a great restaurant?" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Good food, a sophisticated atmosphere, high standards of service," he replied, though he could hear the doubt creeping into his own voice. Evelyn nodded slowly. "And tell me, do you think turning someone away based on their appearance aligns with those high standards?" Richard swallowed. He sighed. There was no excuse. "No, it doesn't." Evelyn leaned against the desk, folding her arms. "This restaurant wasn't built just for the wealthy or the well-dressed," she said. "When I opened Le Grand Bistro, I wanted it to be a place where people could experience warmth, comfort, and respect. no matter who they were or what they looked like. Richard remained silent, guilt twisting inside him. He had been so focused on maintaining a luxurious image that he had forgotten the heart of hospitality itself. Evelyn exhaled, then motioned for him to sit. "Tell me honestly, why did you assume I didn't belong here?" He hesitated. "Because you didn't look like the kind of person who usually dines here." She tilted her head. "And what does that kind of person look like?" His throat went dry. There was no right answer. He had let unconscious bias cloud his judgment, and now he was sitting face to face with the consequences. Evelyn studied him for a moment, then spoke, her voice softer now. "I don't believe you're a bad person, Richard. But if you're going to manage my restaurant, you need to understand what real hospitality means. It's not about exclusivity. It's about making people feel welcome." He nodded slowly. "You're right. I was wrong." For the first time since they had entered the office, Evelyn smiled. Just a small, knowing smile. "That's a start." She straightened up. "I'm not firing you, Richard, but I am making some changes." He blinked, surprised. "Changes?" "Yes," she said. "Tomorrow morning, you and I are going to spend a day volunteering at a community shelter. You'll see firsthand what it means to serve people with dignity, no matter their circumstances." Richard felt a mix of relief and nervousness. I understand." Evelyn opened the door, signaling the conversation was over. "Good. Now, let's go back out there and make sure this restaurant is truly welcoming. Starting tonight." Richard stood, nodding. As he stepped out into the dining area, he looked around the restaurant with fresh eyes. He had spent years believing that fine dining was about luxury, but tonight, he had learned a different truth. It wasn't just about food or prestige. It was about respect. And that was something he would never forget. The next morning, Richard arrived at the community shelter as the sun cast a golden glow over the quiet streets. He had barely slept the night before, his mind replaying his conversation with Evelyn. Now, standing in front of the shelter's modest entrance, he felt out of place in his neatly pressed shirt and polished shoes. Evelyn was already there, dressed in simple jeans and a sweater, chatting warmly with a group of volunteers. She noticed him and waved him over. "Glad you came," she said with a smile. "Are you ready?" Richard nodded, though in truth he wasn't sure. He had spent years managing a high-end restaurant, ensuring the perfect dining experience for wealthy patrons. But this was unfamiliar territory. Inside the shelter, the air smelled of fresh bread and warm soup. Volunteers moved efficiently, handing out plates of food, refilling drinks, and chatting with guests. Some of the people wore tattered clothes. Others carried all their belongings in worn-out bags, but their smiles were genuine as they thanked the volunteers. Evelyn handed Richard a ladle and pointed to a large pot of soup. "You'll be serving today." He hesitated, then stepped forward. As the first guest approached, a woman in her 60s with tired eyes and a kind smile, Richard filled her bowl. "Enjoy your meal," he said, almost out of habit. The woman chuckled. "I will, sweetheart. Thank you." Person after person came forward. Some greeted him cheerfully, others barely made eye contact. But with each bowl he served, something shifted inside him. These weren't just faces in a crowd. They were people, each with a story. As the line thinned, Richard wiped his hands and glanced at Evelyn, who was speaking with a man in a worn-out army jacket. She listened intently, nodding as he spoke. Richard realized something. She wasn't just here to feed them. She was here to see them, to acknowledge them. Later, as they sat on a bench outside the shelter, Richard let out a breath. "I judged them," he admitted, "just like I judged you that night." Evelyn nodded but said nothing, letting him process his own realization. "I thought luxury meant exclusivity," he continued. "But what's the point of fine dining if it only welcomes a select few? Shouldn't hospitality mean treating everyone with dignity?" Evelyn smiled. "Now you understand." Richard looked out at the street, watching as the shelter guests went about their day. "I want to do better," he said. "Not just at the restaurant, but in how I see people." Evelyn stood, brushing off her jeans. "Then let's start by making Le Grand Bistro a place that truly welcomes everyone." Richard followed her lead, stepping back into the world with a new perspective. He had come here to learn a lesson, but what he had gained was something far greater: a deeper understanding of humanity, kindness, and the true meaning of hospitality. And he would carry that lesson with him forever. The following week at Le Grand Bistro felt different. The air was still filled with the rich aromas of gourmet dishes, and the chandeliers still cast their golden glow over polished tables. But something had shifted. Richard had changed. He moved through the restaurant with a sharper awareness, watching how guests were treated, not just by the waitstaff but by himself. He noticed the small hesitations, the way a hostess glanced at a customer's clothes before deciding where to seat them, the way a waiter's tone subtly shifted depending on the perceived wealth of the guest. And he didn't like it. Evelyn had given him a second chance, and he wasn't about to waste it. One evening, as Richard reviewed reservations at the front desk, the hostess leaned over and whispered, "Sir, there's a man at the door. He doesn't really look like our usual clientele. Should I tell him we're fully booked?" Richard looked up. At the entrance stood an older man, his coat tattered, his shoes scuffed. He held his hat in his hands, hesitating, as if already expecting rejection. A week ago, Richard might have turned him away. But not tonight. Richard stepped forward, offering a warm smile. "Welcome to Le Grand Bistro. Do you have a reservation?" The man shook his head, his voice quiet. "No, I just—" He cleared his throat, suddenly self-conscious. "I was hoping to just sit somewhere for a little while. I won't cause any trouble." Richard nodded, ignoring the curious stares from nearby patrons. "Right this way, sir." He led the man to a comfortable corner table by the window and handed him a menu. "Tonight's special is rosemary lamb, but if you'd prefer something else, just let me know." The man blinked in surprise. You're really letting me eat here?" Richard smiled. "Every guest is welcome here." A few minutes later, Evelyn strolled in, pausing as she noticed the older man at the table. Then she glanced at Richard, a knowing look passing between them. Without a word, she walked over to the table, pulled up a chair and sat down. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. The man hesitated, then nodded. As the evening went on, the soft hum of conversation filled the restaurant, and Richard knew Le Grand Bistro wasn't just a place of luxury anymore. It was a place of warmth, a place of dignity, a place where everyone belonged. and for the first time he felt proud to be a part of it. As the evening unfolded, the older man sat a little straighter, his initial hesitation melting away as he enjoyed his meal. Evelyn chatted with him like an old friend, asking about his life, his favorite foods, and his dreams. Conversations Richard had once reserved only for VIP guests. Across the room, some diners exchanged curious glances, but no one dared to object. Richard stood near the bar, watching the scene with quiet satisfaction. This was what Evelyn had envisioned, a restaurant that didn't just serve fine food, but fine humanity. After finishing his meal, the man stood, pulling out a few crumpled bills from his pocket. Evelyn gently placed her hand over his. "Tonight's on us," she said with a warm smile. Tears welled in the man's eyes. He nodded, voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for treating me like I mattered." As he stepped out into the night, Richard exhaled, feeling something in him settle. He had spent years believing that exclusivity was the key to prestige, but now he saw the truth. Real hospitality wasn't about who could afford luxury, but about who felt seen, valued, and respected. Evelyn walked over, hands in her pockets. "You did good tonight," she said. Richard chuckled. "I had a good teacher." She grinned. "You're not done learning yet." As she turned to walk away, Richard stayed behind for a moment, watching the warm glow of the restaurant spill onto the sidewalk. Le Grand Bistro wasn't just a place for the wealthy anymore. It was a place for everyone. And that, he realized, was the greatest legacy of all.